It's wonderful to have you all here, and of course, thank you guys for agreeing to speak. We'll jump right into it. I obviously want to give you each a chance to lay out your stance on the question that we've come here to discuss, which is whether or not it's the duty of scientists to communicate their research to a wider audience. Should we start with you, Anna?
Sure. The short answer, I think, is yes, it is their duty. But that, for me, comes with a lot of caveats. So the reason I think that it is a scientist's duty to convey what they're doing in the lab to the public is that a lot of science research is publicly funded by the research councils. So if the public are paying for science using their taxes, then they have a right to know what it's being spent on, which is the kind of economic argument. For me personally, I found that science communication was really valuable for my own enthusiasm about my subject. So that's like a little personal anecdote. But the other side of this, like why you wouldn't want to necessarily communicate science to the public. We were talking about controversial science earlier. Maybe you can touch a bit on that. That's more your area of expertise. But I've seen lots of terrible SciComm, unfortunately. And researchers and academics are not really given that much training in it either. It's not recognised very well by institutions as a valuable thing, which is one problem with it. But the thing that I'd want to end on is that sometimes you can do more harm than good with science communication. For example, sending someone, I'll use the example of a middle-class man, no offence intended to anyone in the room, but sending someone like that to an all-girls school or to an inner-city school, someone so that the people receiving that information are not seeing anyone that they really relate to doing the science communication. Sometimes that can actually do more harm than good and can turn people off science at an early age. So yes, science communication is good, but under certain circumstances.
Makes perfect sense. Kath?
Anna just said all the things that I was going to say. So yeah, again, very much would agree that science communication is a good thing. I think the word duty, it might be a slightly tricky one in that I think if you make something a duty, it could be something that people then resent. And scientists are busy people, they have lots of other things to do. And if they're not enthusiastic about it, like you say, then it could be more harmful than good. But I do think all scientists have a duty, particularly when they're publicly funded or when they work in areas that will have direct impact on people's lives. It's their duty to, I suppose, cooperate when called upon to communicate their work.
Sure.
And I think for people in other areas, perhaps it is more about enthusiasm and giving people the opportunity to get involved, but maybe not forcing them.
Yeah. Rob?
Well, it's all set. No, I totally agree. And specifically, if you look, I don't think you should make it a duty for you to communicate your science at all levels, because it's actually really hard. So of course we communicate. Probably the largest part of my job as leading a group is communicating our research, but that's mostly to our field, it's to experts. But then also it's harder to communicate your work to non-experts, even though they're in science, and then to the lay public is even harder. And I think if you make it a duty and everybody has to communicate their science to all the different levels, it will definitely do more harm than good, because it will confuse people. And especially if you're on social media, there are people that are going to troll you. And if you don't have the patience, you're going to be worse off, because you're going to attack them and you're going to be defensive. So I think that, yes, it is definitely your duty to communicate your science, but you have to be good at it. You have to be recognized where your talents lay, at what audience you can communicate it to. And I don't think that every scientist has to be able to communicate their science to the general public. You should identify people that can tell about the science being done in a particular field. So for instance, this was of course the cell cycle meeting. We have the perfect spokesperson for that, which is Paul Nurse. So he can explain it to a general audience. And he does that really well, and he can convince the MRC, which of course the research councils, but also the charities, to donate their money to do fundamental research. And that's enough. You don't need everybody that's funded for cell cycle research to communicate their science, as long as you have some people that do it really well as your spokesperson.
Mm-hmm. Cool, really interesting answers. I think it's clear that we all think that scientists need to communicate their science on some level, especially when there's public funding involved, but they need to be good at what they do. They could be more harm than good, but I'm going to go all in and play devil's advocate here because it's more fun. And the notion of so we talk about scientists needing to communicate their science, but shouldn't scientists be focusing on the science and things like experimental design, testing hypotheses, analysing data, focusing on what they do, as opposed to then having the extra step of being, I need to communicate this to not only the people in my field, but potentially to a wider audience, potentially to other funding bodies. And there are so many scientists that are so bad and they feel, because they can't do it, not because they're just kind of deficient in something, because it isn't what they're good at, what they enjoy, and it makes them uncomfortable. So maybe this isn't the opportunity for them to communicate stuff, maybe not the duty, and instead we should let them focus on the science, and maybe this is the chance for a specific SciComm's role. So what I'm saying is maybe scientists do the science, and let someone else do something else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, go ahead.
I can see why you would say that. Someone trained in SciComm would theoretically be better at communicating than someone that wasn't. But there's all sorts of SciComm. So yes, a SciComm trained person might be better at conveying facts. But another part of SciComm is showing people who scientists are and what they're like and what they do in the day-to-day. And so if you really need someone that does that, and to be the person who says, I'm a scientist, I also like swimming, or I'm a scientist, I like the trumpet, and to give a human aspect is really important as well.
Just to add to that, I think it's very beneficial for every scientist to be able to pitch their work to a lay audience. And even though they don't have to do it, just to train them in doing so, because you look at the bigger picture and you place your work into a bigger overall aim of either your field or even what you're doing in the lab. So I think it's beneficial for every scientist to be forced maybe even to pitch it to a general public. I mean, they always say, try to pitch it to your grandma or your 10-year-old niece or whatever. And I think it's very beneficial for every scientist to do it. That it's not said that they then should go out and pitch it to everybody or go onto SciComm or on Twitter. But I think it would be very beneficial if everybody at least tried to do it, even though it's, focus on your research, but to put your research into a context, it's really beneficial to pitch it to a general public.
The other thing about duty as well is that there are lots of, science affects everybody, like be that technology or global warming or GM crops, like all these questions that we all hear about in the news. And it's, like the public needs to be informed about what is going on in science. And there was a study that was done called Public Attitudes to Science, which was done over time. The most recent one was 2014, and they're doing a new one really soon. And that said that the public view scientists very favourably. They like scientists. They think that they're doing a good job. They don't think that they're very good at communication. And they also a lot of the public didn't actually recognise that science was publicly funded, which is interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting.
I think obviously it's in my interests for jobs for science communicators, specialists, to exist. And I think it's important to recognise that when we're talking about scientists communicating, we're not expecting people to do it on their own. You don't wake up one morning and find a way of reaching the public. There are lots of routes to do that, and there are lots of people in roles like mine or our public engagement team who can help with that, whether that's sort of providing the channels to do that or providing the skills for people or the environment in which to do that. But there is, well, certainly here, there's quite a lot of support for people, and I think it is something that's growing in universities and that kind of thing. So I think the more scientists communicate, the more there will be a need for people to help them, really.
Yeah. Cool.
And I guess if you train all scientists to pitch their work to a lay audience, then you can also recognize who has a talent for it.
Yeah.
And then you can, of course, promote those people to then be your voice for the scientific community.
Yeah, the point about science affecting everybody's lives is quite an interesting one in terms of people having a duty to do it. For example, you would never ask a politician to only do politics and not talk to the public, because what they do immediately affects the public. So I think science is just another good example of that.
Great. So obviously SciComms happens through a bunch of channels, and we've all touched on social media briefly, and I think SciComms has been thrown into the limelight on social media. There's been the rise of #ScientistWhoSelfie, and that's received a ton of positive and occasional negative feedback, and there's been a bit of furore around that. So I'm just wondering where you all come down on scientists using social media to communicate their research. Is it helping or is it hindering science? Do you want to start, Rob?
I think, again, it is really hard to communicate it on social media because you have to be thick-skinned and you have to have the patience and the time to answer the questions rightly most of the times. So I think using social media to put out what you're doing is probably not as effective. But if you see a tweet that goes either against or as a question and that you are an expert in the field, I think you should try to answer the question. But I recognize that it's really hard. I just don't have the time to really get into it, and the patience actually to answer most of the questions. Yeah. But I think it would be very beneficial if people did, because that a lot of people, that's where they get their information from. Yeah, absolutely. So us as experts to weigh in on whatever issue they're addressing, I think it's very important. But it's not easy.
No, absolutely not. I know there's a worry from supervisors and more senior staff from their maybe PhD students potentially sharing data. Everyone's worried about getting scooped and putting out sensitive data, but I know people that are advocating, just put your data out there, here's my raw data, here are my data sets, this is what I've done. It almost becomes like a reference for them. So I can see that people are worried about that sort of thing, but from my perspective, I personally think that you should be communicating as much as possible and using what channels you have available. And I think, but to your point, you do need to be thick-skinned to rely on social.
You do have to be a little bit careful about sharing stuff. For example, today I made a big mess in the lab and I wanted to share it on social media, but I had my samples in the big mess. But I purposefully took my samples out of the photo because they're not published yet and all this stuff. And you do have to be a little bit careful. So I just published a really messy thing without any samples on. No, so there's ways of doing it, I guess.
That's
selectively.
Yeah, definitely. There were pieces of software that cropped up, things like a Fig Share from Digital Science cropped up at some point, and that was you can literally upload your data set to the web and you get kind of reference for it. So in the future, someone says, I've done this study, you can say, well, actually, here's my thing from Fig Share that I published last year, for example. So it's almost proofing yourself from being scooped. And so I think it's a kind of double-edged thing. I see why people want to share their stuff, but then I also understand people being terrified of putting it out there.
I think social media and the digital ways that you can share data are quite separate, though. I don't see a lot of people looking like they just fancy tweeting the results of an experiment on a particular afternoon or that kind of thing. I must follow you on Twitter. But yeah, I do think that's a concern, but it doesn't seem to have gone anywhere. Whereas I think the more formal uploading of data to Martin's here, so I'm feeling the pressure. I think that that kind of open science is great, but quite different to trying to communicate your science to the public on social media.
I think another thing as well is the audiences of social media. So as I was starting to think about this, I thought, well, everyone's on social media. You can contact people all over the world, and that's amazing. It breaks down barriers. But actually, there are demographics of people that use the different sites. So I think in general, huge generalization, but I think in general, Twitter tends to be used by people in their late 20s and older, mid to late 20s and older, whereas the younger generations, so I'm told, use things like Snapchat and Instagram and, help me out. That's it, isn't it? I don't know. Yeah. But other social media channels that aren't Twitter. And Facebook tends to be a little bit more, sort of less public. So I often wonder, actually, when I'm doing tweeting, I'm probably actually preaching to the converted a little bit and struggling to reach younger people. And when I do talks to the younger generations, I sort of think, follow me on Twitter. Oh, no, you're not going to be there. So how are we going to ever keep in touch? So it's an interesting sort of conundrum, that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I really quite like the idea of sharing data on social. I understand that obviously maybe you don't want sensitive information, but there's something about you've just finished a result and you want to say, I've done it, it worked, it finally works, and you want to splash it all over social, but then there are those kind of implications that this is unpublished data, no one has it, there is the potential to reuse it.
But I also think it's not that useful if you don't put it in the context of the entire story. So you might be really excited to get a result.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter what the result is. I mean, on Twitter, you just say you got the result, and that's good enough. But I think if there's anything on Twitter, for instance, and I mean that dates me, on Instagram, if I see something on Instagram.
Just Insta.
Sorry. That is like a misconception of what you know, where you are an expert in, then I think you should try to rectify that.
Yeah.
But the problem is that once the people that follow you and the ones that you follow are, it's your own little niche, right? So your outreach is actually not that wide, and you're just preaching to the choir. So I don't think how that is going to really help anyways.
So is social then potentially just actually rather limited? We think of social as being this channel to reach a huge audience, but actually, as you said, you're speaking to people that are the converted choir anyway. So actually, you're just speaking to people that agree with you. So your reach is, well, ironically quite limited.
In general, I think that's true. Yeah. I mean, you can occasionally tap into a hashtag. I did an everyday sexism hashtag. Am I still on? Yeah.
Still on.
A hashtag's everyday sexism to do with a story about sexism in science. And then I reached a different audience. And so there's ways of doing it, but I think in general we do tend to be sort of only communicating within our sort of circles.
Okay.
I think just because you could use, to date me, Twitter, as a way of reaching a wider audience doesn't mean that you necessarily do, because just being there doesn't mean that people will necessarily notice you, and probably to purposefully reach people that you don't normally, you have to put a bit of effort in, and perhaps use accounts that maybe do have that kind of audiences and team up, and or use hashtags and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's not just setting something up and imagining people will flock.
The algorithms as well probably maintain your bubble rather than like being able to reach other places, I think.
Yeah, I think that's happened everywhere. I think even on LinkedIn, I'm now in some weird copywriting scientific bubble, and it's like just the people that agree with me. I'm like, LinkedIn's fantastic, everyone agrees with me. It's maybe not achieving what I want to do. So I want to come on to maybe solutions to reaching a bigger audience. But before that, I think we had some pre-meeting questions that people sent in. We do, hurrah. Grab a mic.
So, some of these things we may have covered a little bit, but I'll start off at the top. Okay, so I'm worried if I post something about my work, I'll get in trouble from my institute or supervisor. Do you have any advice for this? I guess you kind of covered a little bit, being a bit careful and like covering up your samples.
It completely depends on what they want to post. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, if it's just their own view, even if it goes against what maybe their supervisor thinks or the institute, as long as they say it's their own views, then that's fine. But if you're going to post a piece of data, right, that might allow somebody else to scoop you, or then of course you have to ask your supervisor. If it is related to your work and that could harm the story that you're building, then you should ask your supervisor. But if it's just your views, as long as it says it's your views, I think you should be fine.
Maybe this is part of the advice section as well. Maybe in the future we'll start seeing PIs issuing, like a guidelines for tweeting or for Instagramming or whatever. Explicitly saying, don't post any photos that will be identifiable, don't post any numerical data. I don't know what it would be. Sounds like it might be quite a good idea because there's a lot of grey areas around this. Yeah.
Well, lots of institutions have social media policies often that you ask your employees to abide by. We've got guidelines where we really just ask people to be sensible and think, before you put something on social media, is it the kind of thing that you would say at a meeting, at a networking event? Would you mind that being attributed to you? And I think that seems like a more straightforward way of just making people think about what they say.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay. I'm going to jump to this one because I like this question. Do you have any opinions on the use of preprints to accelerate science communication? So things like bioarchive. These.
Yeah, I think those are great. Rather than posting just one result, it's that's out of context. It's not going to help anybody. But of course, the preprints before it's published is very useful for both parties. So it's good for people to know what is already there, even before it's published, and it's good for you to get any feedback on it. And also, it already counts as a publication. So if somebody else would publish it, you were still the first one, and now like Wellcome Trust counts it as a publication as well. So if you apply for a fellowship, to get something published takes about a year. While of course at the end of your PhD you want to apply for a postdoc position. If you just put it in bioarchive, then people can see that you already had some output, and they can also assess your science. So I think it's great, and it's being used more and more.
Yeah. Is it something that you've used yourself, or something that you? Sorry, I'm asking questions.
Not yet. We haven't
Okay,
used it
yeah.
yet, but
Yeah.
I mean, we're thinking about it. Specifically in that situation that somebody just started a postdoc position and they're applying for fellowships.
Yeah.
So we're wondering whether it would be good for her to have it archived,
Yeah.
so she can put that on her CV when she applies for fellowships, rather than waiting for it to be published.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's good. Like, we recently published an article on Tipbox about it. So one of my friends used it, and he was having a lot of trouble getting published, and he put it on bioarchive, and the editor of EMBO saw it through Twitter, and they were like, oh, I love this story, so maybe you should just submit it to EMBO. So it's a good way of getting that kind of visibility. But I guess there's also a lot of problems with it still. So certain journals apparently won't accept your paper if it's already been in preprints and this
I
kind
don't
of thing.
think there are many of them. I mean, it used to be that way. I think PNAS didn't want to, because they would consider it as a publication, but I think it's shrinking the number of journals
it's
that
starting
don't
to
accept it anymore.
change for sure. But yeah, there are.
I think it's a win-win.
Yeah.
Win. Yeah.
For sure.
Go for it.
So with science communications, do you think it could be a bit of a generation thing? So that kind of our generation coming up now will have used social media for a lot of their kind of, young adult to adult life. So maybe are more used to sharing and more used to kind of using these kind of tools. And so maybe scientists coming up now will be more inclined to use social media as opposed to previous generations that maybe didn't have access to these tools.
Yeah, that's definitely true. If you look at who are the big players in SciComm at the moment, the people at professor level, they tend to be the ones doing the TV and the radio and the quite traditional media. Platforms like YouTube don't have any of those kind of gatekeeping things, so anyone can become a science YouTuber. So we're definitely starting to see younger people getting involved in science communication and not having to wait for 40 years until they have kind of the credibility of being on TV. They can do it in their 20s and have a YouTube channel, and a lot of people have really successfully done that. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if that could also be a barrier at the same time. So we have like the younger generation, you said that's you just share on social. It's not a thing, it's just what you do, it's part of the culture. And then the next level up that have more authority are a bit more adverse to that. So does that potentially represent a barrier to SciComms, that generational difference between the young student and maybe the supervisor/PI?
I think it's coming hand in hand with a recognition of the importance of science communication across the board, though. So in terms of funding bodies providing specific public engagement funding, for example, or the idea of asking people to write lay summaries and grant applications and that kind of thing. So there is a recognition anyway. So I guess with younger people, there's social media and a more institutional level onus on it. So yeah, so probably I think maybe for slightly older people, they're getting that cultural change as well, but they might not hop onto YouTube to fulfill that.
Cool.
And also more and more the impact of your study is being measured by how often it's mentioned in social media. So before it was citations, and by publications in other journals. And now you get metrics that includes how often it's been mentioned on Facebook or on Twitter, or how many blogs, and where all over the world, it will highlight where those blogs or where the Twitter accounts were. So I think it is going to, in the end, it's going to, the old generation will just have to face the music, and it will be, your outreach will be measured not just by how often it's cited, but also how much is mentioned in social media.
Yeah, that's really cool. Okay, sure. I guess we'll wrap up then. So I think it's been really interesting. I like the idea that obviously it's not as simple as yes, you have to communicate, or no, it's not up to you. And there's a whole bunch of caveats, and it's a lot to consider. But I think the consensus is that communication of science is only a good thing overall. So what's the what are the solutions here? What can we do to get more scientists communicating? Is it an institutional thing? I know Kathy mentioned that there's already a great setup here with an engagement team and a comms team. Is there a responsibility of journals to kind of request more like graphical abstracts or kind of plain language abstracts? More formal training for undergrads? I mean, there's loads of things. I'm interested to see what you think could be a good next step to get more people communicating or more comfortable with communicating. Rob?
I would say training for students and postdocs would be the first step. And that's just to get everybody used to communicating their research at a more basic level, and also to recognize who's good at it. Because at the end of the day, I think that's very important, because you say overall it's a good thing, but I think it could also be really bad if the person that's doing it actually can't pitch it. It just makes things worse. So I think just having training and then recognizing people that are good at it and like to do it, and are enthusiastic about it, to foster those within an institute. And you just need a few of them. You don't need everybody to do it. And then just train them into using, several outlets, and also at different levels. So some people are good to pitching it at non-experts, but still academics, or just lay people, or the real experts, right? You just have to recognize what people are good at, and then foster those talents.
Perfect. Kath, anything to say?
I think as well as that, some of it's about a change in culture where people respect people who want to do science communication. So where if PhD students are really interested in spending time on that's something that they're allowed to do, rather than being seen as a jolly on the side, and people respecting it's actually an important part of their work. So that's one thing. That's probably the main one for me.
Yeah, cool.
Well, the other thing we haven't mentioned as well is that it really benefits scientists as well. And I'm sure we've all been to conferences and had to sit through a whole session where they really struggle to communicate even to their subject peers. And that's a waste of everyone's time. So even just giving like basic communication skills and getting a bit more confident in presenting can help scientists communicate science to other scientists, which is really good. One thing I would like to say is, in the situation where we might start to select people that are quite talented in terms of communication to be sort of the spokespeople, often that onus will fall onto people from minority groups, such as women in my field of engineering. Minority groups, often if you need a photo shoot for the brochure, or you need someone to go off and do a schools thing, it's right that you should try and represent whatever your audience is in who you're sending, but then are you then like putting loads of work on people who already have quite a lot of work to do just to be in that space in the first place? So we need to be mindful of training the right people and supporting them as well.
Great. I think that's all we have time for. So thank you all so much.